Hello and welcome to Behind the Bad Podcast with me, Porcelain Victoria. We are still on Revolting Prostitutes. This is part 10 now, I believe. And we're starting with chapter 4. We've actually made like a good dent in this. I'm like so happy. I'm sure at some point soon I'm gonna need recommendations on what other book to read next. I'm really enjoying the book in frustration, honestly, with how ridiculous and sad a lot of it is in the ways of how the government is and how other feminists are, and it's sad. It really is. So let's hop in. I would also like to mention hello to any new listeners. I'm sure you can just read this, well, listen to this straight off the bat. But we do have a part 1 if you want to go listen to that. It is a few pages down. There is a new podcast episode every Monday, and there is a new podcast book reading every Thursday. And every Thursday we do about 10 pages. And yeah. So, welcome to Behind the Paddle podcast. I'm Porcelain Victoria. And this is Revolting Prostitutes, The Fight for Sex Workers' Rights by Molly Smith and Juno Mack. Chapter 4. A Victorian Hungover Great Britain. Partial criminalization. A legal model where some aspects of the sex industry, often the most visible, such as street-based sex work, are criminalized. Within England, Scotland, and Wales, the acts of buying and selling sex are legal, but almost everything else is criminalized. For example, soliciting and curb crawling, working indoors with friends, or facilitating sex work. In the weeks leading up to Christmas 2006, sex workers in the small British town of Ipswich feared for their lives. The bodies of 2 sex-working women had been found in the previous week, and the killer was still at large. Out in the quiet streets, a local news film crew approached a young woman named Paula Clennell, one of the few who remained waiting for clients in the usual spot. When asked why was she risking her life out on the streets when a murderer was on the loose, she explained, quote, "I have to work, I need the money," end quote. Paula, a mother of 3 in her 20s, had been selling sex for some time. After her children were taken away from her, she became depressed, and by the winter of 2006, her dependency on heroin and cocaine had reached a stage where she needed an income of around £100 a day to support herself. For Paula, as for so many people in similar situations, selling sex was the only viable way to obtain this kind of money. A friend encouraged her to try indoor escorting in the hope it would be safer, as well as legal under British law. But in her situation, that level of organization and financial overhead was unrealistic. Street work was, though criminalized, meant she could sell sex wherever she wanted and return home with instant cash. She had no partner and no manager to split her money with. A few days after her appearance on the news, Paula vanished. By Christmas, her body had been found, along with those of 4 other women. Steve Wright, a local man, was later found guilty of all 5 murders. 9 years later, Daria Pionko's smiling face jumped out of news reports. Daria was just 21 and had moved from Poland to Britain 10 months before. Daria's mother, Lydia, described her as a kind-hearted and joyful girl who was always eager to help others. A few days before Christmas 2015, a young man named Louis Pierre kicked Daria to death in Holbeck, Leeds, in order to steal £80 from her. Daria's body was discovered by her housemate and friend, Carolina, who was also a street-based worker. Daria had been working in the Holbeck, quote, managed area. This is a place where street-based sex workers and clients can meet without fear of arrest, an arrangement the only one of its kind in Britain. In most of Britain, sex workers who wait for clients in public places may be charged with, quote, soliciting or, quote, loitering with intent to commit prostitution. Their clients may also be charged with, quote, curb crawling. Daria left the managed area with Pierre, as was compulsory. Although sex workers can meet clients without fear of arrest in the Holbeck zone, sex there was not permitted. They were forced to leave the managed area and find a dark alley or patch of woodland where they conduct business in secrecy. In doing so, sex workers risk arrest. They also, of course, are at risk of attack in these hidden spaces. When Louis Pierre reappeared in the lens of the same CCTV camera that caught him walking away from the managed area with Daria, he had blood on his steel-capped shoes. In response to such horrific stories, it is easy to make them purely about male brutality and the disposability of prostitutes. These themes have resonance for us too, as they surely do for any sex worker who has stepped into a car or a hotel with a stranger. The emphasis on male violence as the conceptual framework through which to understand these murders allows non-prostitute women who may themselves be survivors of male violence to empathically and discursively, quote, enter into the experience of the prostitute. While this empathy is welcome, there is a danger that this sands away the specifics of Paula and Daria's lives, and the lives and experiences of prostitutes as a whole, which then become draped around the figure of the, quote, every woman. As Beth Ritchie argues, the, quote, every woman, victim/survivor concept was created in the 1970s as a strategic rhetorical move on the part of the nascent feminist movement to demand attention for the epidemic of male violence. But this has transmuted over time into something closer to a focus on the, quote, default woman. And the, quote, default woman is certainly not a drug user or a sex worker, nor is she a survivor of state violence. Daria and Paula's lives were shaped by specific realities, including the ever-present threat of criminalization. These young women were acting rationally in a system designed to harm them at every turn. Instead of asking questions about how the state makes women like Daria and Paula unsafe, media coverage tends to channel the worldview of their aggrieved neighbours. The fact that selling sex is technically not a crime in Britain does seem little to render sex workers relatable or grievable in the eyes of police, residents, or journalists. Sympathetic perceptions of sex workers are readily tossed aside for something more callous. Mike Veal, chief of the Wiltshire Police, indicated that when a prostitute reports a crime, he takes her less seriously than other victims. Quote, "If you have a 6-year-old girl who has trauma in her vagina or anus, you would expect me to believe her. If you have a drunken prostitute making allegations regarding a bad debt, you have to make more of a judgment." Judgments of this type are not in short supply. A few years after the Ipswich killings, one journalist wrote, quote, "The girls killed in Ipswich were not working in the stupidity PC term, quote, sex industry. They were junkies. Can we afford rehab for the girls in Ipswich and everywhere else?" Speaking as a taxpayer, I'd say, well, good question, end quote. Indeed, it seems the Ipswich killings and the questions they raise drew a particularly vicious strain of rhetorical cruelty into the public arena, suggesting that hatred of sex workers and collective guilt about social neglect are closely bound together. Another journalist called the 5 Ipswich women, quote, "disgusting, drug-addicted street whores," end quote, and brindled at what he considered excessive mourning, writing, quote, "We do not share the responsibility for either their grubby little existences or their murders. Society isn't to blame. Death by strangulation is an occupational hazard," end quote. Who, then, or what is to blame? Why didn't Paula and her friends have access to a flat they could have taken turns using with clients instead of being driven away alone in a car? Why was she paying £500 a day for opioids that the National Health Service could have provided in a safe version for a fraction of the cost? Why was she stuck trying to manage her trauma through street heroin instead of through more sustainable support services? Instead of being supported to be the loving parent she desperately wanted to be? Paula was left depressed and in profound poverty. For Daria, too, these questions bubble up painfully. An evaluation of the Holbeck managed area had already noted months before Daria's murder that the, quote, "most notable time of risk for sex workers is away from the managed area," end quote. Women like Daria and Paula need so little, some basic safety and resources, that it is so easy to imagine society meeting those needs. Yet, at the same time, they needed so much. In that to imagine a society takes their safety seriously is to imagine a society profoundly transformed. Low class, high class. As with much else in Britain, including immigration and drug use, class plays a huge role in the way sex work manifests and stratifies. Prostitution law is produced by archaic class structures and in turn produces a microcosm of that class system within the bounds of the sex industry, where values of decorum, property, decency, and discretion are reshaped to fit the world of commercial sex. The law attempts to establish what is and is not respectable on the long spectrum of the sex trade, from bareback blowjobs against a parked car to sugar babying in exchange for tuition fees and appears to grant a degree of exception to that which is discreet or invisible. Technically, the only way to sell sex in Britain without getting into legal trouble is to work alone and indoors, and for migrants with the relevant documentation. Labels like elite or high class often attach to those who more or less meet this requirement, and those terms signify the sex worker's position within the class strata of sex work, even though such phrases are primarily advertising keywords and frequently have only a tenuous link to a worker's actual socio-economic class. It is in more exposed spaces like the streets or conspicuous red light establishments that sex workers are most often perceived as being, quote, low class, immoral, or simply a nuisance. This is also where they are seen to be the most victimized and exploited, which provides a convenient justification for even harsher policing. Soliciting on the street, curb crawling, managing sex workers, and working in groups, even pairs, are all criminalized, along with, quote, procuring or inciting people into sex work. Sex workers seen to be breaking these laws are framed as an embarrassing stain on the fabric of British society, a terrible hypervisual burden on all who regard them. To take one revealing example, a neighbourhood group seeking to end the managed area of Holbeck, Leeds, is named Save Our Eyes, and is far more concerned about the scourge of, quote, scantily clad women in public spaces than the prospect of actual violence against those women. Where irate residents can't provoke police crackdowns on sex workers to, quote, clean up the community, they sometimes resort to vigilante violence. When residents of Balsall Heath, Birmingham, mobilized against street-based sex workers in the mid-1990s, sex workers were harassed and physically threatened, including with baseball bats and dogs. Their windows were smashed, and the sex worker who objected was forcefully removed from a community meeting. Vigilantes lit fireworks and pushed them through a sex worker's letterbox and fired an air gun into her house. While street workers bear the brunt of public discontent, most sex work in Britain happens indoors, in the worker's flat or the client's flat, or in rented temporary apartments and hotels. But staying within the law is almost impossible when the law is broad enough to encompass basically everything prostitution entails beyond this actual sex. To, quote, incite someone does not entail force. It can mean simply supporting or advertising them before they begin sex work. When police attempted to close working flats in Soho, London in 2013, they defined, quote, incitement to mean calling a job application back to talk to them about potentially working in the flat. Arranging a second sex worker's involvement in a threesome might also be, quote, causing or inciting. A brothel can be any property in which more than one prostitute works, even if they work at different times and never cross paths. persistent fears of such rules and their consequences, in particular eviction and loss of child custody, have a preemptive disciplinary effect on all people selling sex across the breadth of the sex industry. They must take the risk and toe the line, or, if they cannot comply with the law, are compelled to be absolutely undetectable in their activities. With laws as complex and outmoded as these, confusion is common among sex workers. Opaque policing mechanisms lead many to simply assume, in the absence of concrete knowledge, that what they're doing must in some way be illegal. This suspicion that they will be treated as criminals significantly impacts their perception of their own human and labor rights. This makes it nearly impossible to exercise those rights in the workplace and diminishes their power of resistant abuses from clients, employers, the police, and violent assailants. Activist Nikki Adams, commenting on a series of violent gang burglaries of London brothels, spoke of, quote, incidents where women have been attacked, and their attackers have told them brazenly that they know the women won't dare go to the police, end quote. As well as risks to safety and security, the situation also a culture full of silences. Very few sex workers are prepared to step forward and speak in political spaces because of the consequences visibly can be disastrous. The few that remain, including the authors of this book, are often dismissed as privileged, unrepresentative, or, quote, high class outliers. But rarely these structures within sex work properly interrogated at the marital level. It's accurate to say broadly that the demographic within sex work politics, most often given a substantial mainstream platform to speak publicly, dovetails with the group that lives in metropolitan cities, commands higher rates with the group, has access to more resources, and suffers the least criticism. Criminalization. But it is an egregious oversight to leave the analysis there. Why are these people the only voices you are hearing? What structures are silencing the others? The mechanisms that produce the silence, precarity, and vulnerability of most sex workers are not natural or fundamental to society, just as the class system itself is not natural. Sex working feminists watch feminist discussions of the, quote, policing of speech, wry amusement. For sex workers, policing is not merely a metaphor. The war on sex workers who use drugs. All 5 of the women Steve Wright killed in Ipswich in 2005, Paula, Anneli, Gemma, Tanya, and Annetta, were dependent drug users. This detail pulled out many times in the media over the following decade is worth mentioning, though not because it allows us to allocate blame to, quote, junkies, or see their deaths as an inevitable and unfixable result of perceived fecklessness or self-destruction. Drugs and the way of the law shapes the lives of people who use them are of direct relevance when examining why these women were working on the street and why they were vulnerable to Wright's attack. Ending the war on drugs is a sex workers' rights issue. In Britain, a significant majority of criminalized sex workers, quote, particularly those working outdoors, have experiences with drug dependency. The most significant link between these two circumstances is money. Drugs can be expensive. For many people, selling sex is the only way to afford the drugs they need, and the level of their dependency dictates the amount they will need to work. Sex workers who use drugs are subject to the criminalization of both drugs and prostitution. And these policies and consequences manifest similarly. Criminalizing drugs not only creates even more risk of police attention and a criminal record, it also makes them illicit and therefore dangerous. As with soliciting laws, laws that mandate the arrest or dispersal of people engaged in drug use in public spaces lead to more clandestine behaviors, which can mean more dangerous drug usage, particularly rushed and risky methods of injecting. Arresting local dealers, who often use drugs as well, pushes people to buy drugs from unfamiliar sources and prevents them from making better informed decisions about the transaction. Taking a risk on a dodgy seeming client because you need the money is a gamble. So is using a prohibited substance which may be mislabeled, quote, cut with other things, or of unknown potency. In both situations, lack whether of money or of safer drugs pushes people into risk, and the risk of you're willing to take grows the more you lack. The desire to avoid withdrawal or poverty changes people's behavior in powerful ways. People who use drugs also have their safety measures destroyed by the police, brackets, much like sex workers. Groups of people keeping watch over each other while they're high are vulnerable to arrest, as are those carrying their own clean, sterilized equipment. Both sex workers and drug users face discrimination in the media, in courtrooms, in healthcare, in dealing with social services, and in formal employment. Doubly so for those who fall into both categories. Sex workers who use drugs are intensely vulnerable to violence because they fear arrest on 2 counts, as the tragic case of Bonnie Barrett, who was murdered in London in 2007 shows. Bonnie's colleagues, like her, were both selling sex and using drugs. Before her death, they had noticed a particular client becoming rougher and more violent. Despite this, they all felt unable to report him or ask for help. This was with good reason. Bonnie herself was arrested more than 30 times prior to her murder. Both groups are forgotten by politicians, even the more progressive of whom are rarely prepared to die on the hill of reforming drug and sex work laws in favor of those who use drugs or sell sex. When commenters engage with the topics of drugs and sex work, it's easier to summon the contemptible figures of the pimp and the dealer, brackets, or better yet, blame the evils of sex and heroin themselves, than to examine the structural context of prostitution and drug use. Examining these contexts would mean answering for the way that governments, not individual villains, are failing 2 of the most vulnerable groups of people in society. As already noted, many people who use drugs, sell sex to get money, to pay for drugs. Sex workers who take drugs often do so to cope with the trauma of work that is often exacerbated by criminalization. Examining this two-way connection between sex work and drug use renders people who use drugs and sell sex as ultimately rational, logical actors who are responding to their environment. This is the perspective that many people find challenging. Even language pushes up against it. Rational people are often described with words that mean, quote, not using drugs, sober, clear-headed. But thinking of sex workers who use drugs as people who are trying their best to survive in a bad situation is necessary. It pushes the public to think of them not as flawed or failing, but as dealing with the big and small ways that society is stacked against them. Helps to identify the big and small challenges that would make them safer, like safe injection facilities, clean needles, safe red light areas, affordable housing, and an end to destitution. Most starkly, prescription opiates would free people from long hours on the street to afford drugs, and instead connect them with healthcare and other services, giving them the knowledge and resources to manage their use safely. To some people, these forms of harm reduction, giving people heroin, needles, and places to use these things, would seem shocking. But are they really more shocking than needless deaths? Sex workers and drug users in Britain are dying every single week in the failed war on drugs. 12 people died in the small Scottish city of Dundee in just 1 month in early 2018 because of the drugs they were using were unsafe. Current British drug policy amounts to a form of, quote, social cleansing. The drugs debate is steeped in the same injustice as sex work debate. When all drug use is constructed as terrible and differences between harms and more sustainable behaviors are flattened out, made invisible, or even reversed, British law is stricter on people smoking cannabis in a park than on people who sniff glue. Despite the latter being far riskier, both groups would be better served by being able to buy legal cannabis. Spice is a synthetic cannabinoid, more addictive than natural cannabis and much more dangerous. Unlike cannabis, spice can cause serious bodily injuries and even deaths. It is the criminalization of cannabis that caused spice to be developed and widely used. The creators of spice were taking advantage of a temporary legal loophole, as the law cannot keep up with the rate that people can invent new compounds. The whack-a-mole game of criminalization pushes people, brackets, both those who use and those who sell, to experiment with riskier and riskier substances in an attempt to keep just ahead of the law. Precarious sex workers who use drugs as maligned and pushed while the middle and upper classes enjoy cocaine, ecstasy, cannabis, ketamine, and LSD on a regular basis. The lack of solidarity from middle-class drug users towards those who are more marginalized is particularly frustrating, given that all drug users, regardless of social class, are affected, to a degree, by drug prohibition. Maybe you were ripped off for a bag of, quote, weed that was mostly herbs, or felt a pang of fear in a nightclub watching a friend pop a mystery pill that you both hoped was ecstasy. Maybe your partner suffered the ill effects of a night on cocaine that had been cut with something cheaper. Across the board, criminalization prevents people who use drugs from being certain what they are taking. There's an argument that weed, pills, and coke are, quote, not as bad as heroin, crack, cocaine, or crystal meth, but it is the people using the drugs, not the drugs themselves, who are branded, quote, good and, quote, bad. The history of drug prohibition has shown us that, quote, problematic people favoring a specific substance is what renders the substance, quote, problematic, not the other way around. It is easy to demonize a drug when demonized people are most strongly associated with it. And although black British people use drugs at a far lower rate than white people, they are searched by police at a much higher rate, as well as prosecuted more intensely if found in possession of drugs. The difference between the, quote, normative citizen, end quote, and the prostitute who uses drugs is a question first and foremost of circumstance and need. Quote, hard drugs are a far more powerful way to cope with a difficult life than party drugs, and often easier to obtain than prescription drugs. Second, it is a difference of policing and social control. Who is targeted? Who can be criminalized? Who is deemed unworthy of a good life? Who is allowed to flourish and prosper? Now, we're going to end on page 98. And wow. Again, every 10 pages is absolutely shocking to me. Absolutely. And every 10 pages, it just makes me sad. And I absolutely love this book because it brings awareness, like sex work. It has ties to everything. Everything. And it comes down to poverty and policing and how the government is and social. Like, I absolutely, I'll be honest, I do not like when I see the words high class escort or anything like that on an advert, because it just makes me sad because they're showing that they're at another like level of dependency on living and such, and like it just makes me sad. There's a lot more to it, but I feel like the book really does explain it really well. And yeah, this is where we're going to leave it because I do have to shoot off. I've had a busy morning. I have had a 2-hour session and done 2 custom videos and then done this podcast. But thank you for listening. I am Porcelain Victoria, and this has been Behind the Paddle podcast. You can find the spicier version on Dark Fans and ManyVids, and of course, I have my own personal stuff. If you want any topics or anything like that, then give us an email. I would absolutely love it if you could give us a review on Spotify, Apple, whatever you're listening on. Absolutely love that. And I think that's round about it. Yeah. Enjoy your day and thanks for listening.